Welcome to Old People Stories. Today we will tell you about Nelson Mandela's, so please subscribe our channel. Let's go to start the video. Nelson Mandela's story does not begin with a man standing before cheering crowds or walking free from prison. It begins far away from fame, in the quiet hills of a rural African village where a young boy once ran barefoot across red earth, unaware that history would one day carve his name into its deepest stone. He was born Rolihlahla Mandela in 1918 in the small village of Mvenzo in South Africa. Rolihlahla was a name that carried a playful meaning, a name that hinted at mischief, at stirring things up, at challenging what others accepted. His family never knew how prophetic that name would become. They simply saw a child with bright eyes, a gentle smile, and a quiet curiosity about the world. His father, Gadla Henry Mpakanyiswa, was a respected village chief and counselor to the Tembu king. His mother, Nosekeni Fanny, was warm, humble, and deeply spiritual. Together, they raised Mandela with a sense of pride in his heritage, and understanding of community, and a belief that every human being held dignity within them. These early lessons would stay with him long after he left the village. Mandela grew up surrounded by stories. His elders would sit under the shade of broad trees and tell tales of African warriors who resisted invaders, of kings who fought for their people, of heroes who defended justice. These stories planted seeds in him long before he understood politics or injustice. He simply learned that courage had a place in every life, no matter how small. When Mandela was 9 years old, his father grew ill and passed away. It was a moment that changed the direction of his life forever. The Tembu regent, a man named Jongintaba, took Mandela in as his ward, raising him in a royal household far from his home village. This shift exposed Mandela to a world richer, more complex, and more structured than he had ever known. In the royal home, Mandela learned discipline. He learned manners, responsibility, and the importance of community leadership. He watched Jongintaba settle disputes, guide his people, and listen patiently to every voice. It was here that Mandela first understood leadership not as authority, but as service. Still, he was just a boy then, a boy who played stick fights with friends, a boy who studied quietly at night, a boy whose dreams were simple and unformed. Yet even then, the world outside was changing. South Africa was a land divided by laws that placed one race above another. Mandela did not yet grasp the full weight of those laws, but he felt their presence in subtle ways, in whispers, in attitudes, in the structure of society.
Mandela attended mission schools, where he encountered teachers who believed education was a weapon more powerful than any spear. They taught him English, history, and the larger world beyond the rolling hills of the Eastern Cape. They taught him ideas that would one day form the backbone of his philosophy. They taught him that the world could be challenged and reshaped. When he entered college at the University of Fort Hare, Mandela stepped into a new world. Fort Hare was the leading institution for black students in South Africa. It was a place where young minds began to question, to challenge, and to dream of change. Here, Mandela met people who would become part of his lifelong journey. They discussed justice and freedom long into the night. They debated ways to transform a nation built on inequality. Yet Mandela's path did not unfold smoothly. He participated in a student protest against the university's policies and was expelled. This moment showed something important about him. He did not seek trouble, but he refused to remain silent when something felt unjust. His expulsion was the first of many consequences he would face for standing up for principle. When Mandela returned home, Jungentaba was disappointed and arranged a marriage for him as punishment. Mandela, unwilling and unprepared, made a bold decision. He fled the royal household and traveled to Johannesburg, a city alive with danger, opportunity, conflict, and possibility. Johannesburg was a turning point. It was here that Mandela saw the brutal reality of racial segregation up close. He saw men and women forced to carry passes, restricted in their movements. He saw poverty enforced by law. He saw the cruelty of the system that would later become known as apartheid. He worked as a mine guard. He worked as a clerk. He struggled to survive in a world that offered few chances and many barriers, but he was determined. He walked the city streets with a quiet strength, absorbing everything, learning, watching, understanding the injustice around him. It was in Johannesburg that Mandela's life began to intertwine with the movement that would define him. He met people involved in the African National Congress, the ANC, a political organization fighting for the rights of Black South Africans. These were thinkers, activists, dreamers. Mandela listened to them, learned from them, and slowly began to see that change required more than hope. It required action. He started studying law. He wanted not only to understand the system of oppression, but to challenge it. He spent long nights reading books, learning cases, and preparing himself for a life of resistance. He understood that words could be weapons, that knowledge could be a shield, and that justice required more than anger. It required strategy. By the time Mandela opened South Africa's first black law firm with his partner, Oliver Tambo, he was no longer the boy from the village. He had become a man shaped by hardship, education, and a growing fire inside him. He was calm, patient, determined, and deeply moral. But he was also beginning to step into the spotlight of a growing struggle, and the government had begun to notice. The story was only beginning. The road ahead would test him in ways no one could imagine. His courage, his endurance, his hope, his faith, and his humanity would all be pushed to the edge. This is where his true transformation began.
Johannesburg became the training ground where Nelson Mandela's character, purpose, and destiny sharpened. Every street he walked carried a story of struggle. Every office he entered revealed the inequalities built into South Africa's laws. Mandela quickly learned that injustice was not an accident. It was a system, designed, enforced, and defended with determination. His involvement with the African National Congress deepened. At first, Mandela joined quietly, attending meetings, listening, understanding the older leaders who had fought for decades. They believed in peaceful protest and patient negotiation. They believed that change could come through petitions, speeches, and legal appeals. But Mandela saw something different in the daily faces of workers, miners, mothers, and young men whose lives were controlled by laws they never agreed to. For the first time, he realized that freedom was not a polite request. It was a fight. He began rising in the African National Congress Youth League, a growing group of young activists who believed the struggle needed new energy. They pushed for stronger actions, more demanding tactics, and a willingness to challenge apartheid directly. Mandela became one of their brightest voices,
calm but firm, reasoned but fiery, a man who spoke with the authority of someone who had lived the injustice he described. As his political life expanded, so too did his personal one. Mandela married Evelyn Mace, a gentle and religious woman. They began a family and tried to build a peaceful life together. But Mandela's dedication to the struggle consumed him. His long absences and heavy responsibilities strained their marriage. The weight of political activism was beginning to press into every part of his life. The balance between family and freedom was already slipping. Then, in 1948, the National Party rose to power and formally created Apartheid, the system that would define South Africa for decades. Under Apartheid, segregation hardened. Every race was assigned to separate areas. Interracial marriage was banned. Black South Africans were stripped of rights, identity, opportunity, and basic humanity. Mandela felt something inside him change. He had always believed in justice, but now he understood the scale of what they were fighting. Apartheid was not just unfair, it was brutal. It was cold. It was an attempt to crush the human spirit. Mandela traveled across the country, organizing protests, leading campaigns, and speaking to crowds with a voice that carried strength and hope. People felt something when he spoke. His presence was steady and powerful. He stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes focused. He embodied dignity in a world that tried to deny it. But the government would not allow voices like his to rise unchallenged. Mandela was watched constantly, followed, and eventually arrested for the first time in 1952. This arrest was only the beginning. It became clear that Mandela's life was now tied to the struggle in a way that could not be undone.
After the arrests, Mandela and his colleague Oliver Tambo opened their law practice in Johannesburg. Their office became a refuge for the poor and oppressed. People lined up outside their doors seeking help against unjust laws, unfair evictions, and police abuse. Mandela never turned them away. He listened patiently to each story, offering the dignity that apartheid tried to steal. Yet while Mandela fought inside courtrooms, the system fought harder outside them. Protests were met with violence. Demonstrations were crushed. And then came a moment that shook the nation. In 1960, the Sharpeville massacre erupted when police opened fire on peaceful protesters. 69 people were killed, many shot in the back as they tried to flee. This tragedy shattered Mandela's faith in nonviolence as the sole weapon of resistance. The peaceful appeals had been met with bloodshed. The government had chosen force. Mandela and other leaders made a painful decision. They formed an armed wing of the ANC called Untold, the Spear of the Nation. Its mission was not to take lives, but to sabotage oppressive structures, power stations, government facilities, symbols of apartheid control. Mandela said years later that they turned to armed struggle only when every other door to freedom had been slammed shut. But this new path came with danger. Mandela went underground, changing safe houses, disguising his identity, moving through the country like a ghost. He became known as the Black Pimpernel, a man the government could not catch. He organized resistance, spread messages, built networks of courage. Still, the state's net grew tighter. The police searched relentlessly, and eventually, in 1962, Mandela was captured. He was put on trial not only for leaving the country illegally, but for his activism. Even in court, Mandela refused to bow his head. His speeches were calm, clear, and fearless. He stood before the judge not as a defendant begging for mercy, but as a man defending the truth. More arrests followed, and then came the trial that would define his life, the Rivonia trial of 1963 and 1964. Mandela and his comrades were accused of sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. The penalty could be death. When Mandela took the stand, he delivered one of the most powerful speeches in modern history. He spoke about equality, justice, and human dignity. He said he fought against both white and black domination. And then he tended with words that stunned the courtroom. He said he cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society where all people live together in harmony and equal rights. And he said it was an ideal for which he was prepared to die. Those words echoed far beyond the courtroom. They reached the world. They ignited a movement. Mandela was ready to sacrifice everything, not for himself, but for his people. The judge did not sentence him to death. Instead, Mandela received life imprisonment, a sentence meant to silence him forever. But history would prove that prison could not silence Nelson Mandela. It would only sharpen the power of his voice.
Nelson Mandela entered prison not as a broken man, but as a determined one. Yet no one, not even Mandela himself, could fully imagine the weight of the years ahead. The bars closed behind him in 1964, and he stepped into a world built to crush the spirit. He was sent to Robben Island, a harsh, isolated prison surrounded by cold waters and endless wind. It was a place designed to erase hope, a place where voices echoed against stone walls and where time seemed frozen. The guards believed that men sent there would eventually surrender to despair, but Mandela carried with him a different kind of strength. The conditions were brutal. Mandela and his fellow prisoners were locked in small, damp cells. Their blankets were thin. Their meals were barely enough to sustain them. They were forced into hard labor, breaking stones under the burning sun or the biting wind. The dust filled their lungs. The work wore down their bodies. Mandela worked in a lime quarry so bright and reflective that it damaged his eyesight permanently. The harsh white dust clung to their skin and clothes, turning every movement into a reminder of their captivity. Even blinking became painful after long hours beneath the relentless light. But prison could not take Mandela's dignity. He carried himself with the same calm presence he had in the courtroom. He spoke respectfully, even to guards who tried to humiliate him. He walked with purpose, even when his feet ached. He held his head high, even when punishment came without reason. And slowly, something unexpected began to happen. The guards started to respect him, not because they agreed with him, but because his integrity was unshakable. Mandela never responded to cruelty with hatred. He believed that every person, even a jailer, had humanity buried beneath fear and ignorance. He would say later that he tried to understand the fears of his oppressors, not just the anger of the oppressed. Mandela maintained discipline among the prisoners. He encouraged them to study, to debate, to exercise, to keep their minds alive. He believed that giving up mentally was more dangerous than any physical hardship. He asked the younger prisoners to stay calm, to avoid fights, to remember that they were not criminals but political prisoners. In time, Robben Island became more than a prison. It became a school. Mandela joked that it was the University of Robben Island, where every prisoner learned, taught, and grew. They studied languages, history, politics, philosophy. Books became a lifeline. Knowledge became a form of resistance, and their minds became fields where freedom could still grow. During these years, Mandela's personal life carried its own struggles. His marriage to Winnie, whom he had loved deeply, suffered under the weight of separation. Winnie was constantly harassed, arrested, and isolated. Mandela could not hold her hand, comfort her, or protect her. He could only write letters, each one limited and heavily censored. His children grew up with their father behind bars. Mandela felt the ache of absence, the guilt of missed years, the quiet grief of a father unable to watch his children grow. Yet in his solitude, Mandela learned something profound. He realized that anger could consume a person from the inside. He understood that if he allowed hatred to take root, it would chain him more tightly than any prison. So he chose forgiveness, not as surrender, but as strength. Forgiveness became his way of staying free while physically imprisoned.
As the years passed, Mandela became a symbol far beyond South Africa. The world began to speak his name. Protests erupted across continents. Artists, activists, students, and leaders called for his release. His face appeared on posters and banners. His message became a beacon for justice. Inside prison, Mandela heard echoes of this rising movement. It gave him hope, but he remained cautious. He knew that change in South Africa would not come quickly. The government was determined to maintain apartheid. They tightened restrictions. They banned organizations. They attacked activists. They made it clear that freedom was not coming soon. But the world was changing. Pressure on South Africa grew. Economies shifted. Politics evolved. And finally, after 21 years on Robben Island, Mandela was moved to Pollsmoor Prison. The conditions were slightly better, but the isolation grew heavier. He missed the companionship of fellow prisoners. He missed the energy of group discussions, the shared strength of collective struggle. Yet, Mandela remained steady. He continued studying. He continued writing. He continued negotiating quietly, subtly, carefully. Government officials began visiting him secretly. They wanted to discuss the future. They hoped Mandela would agree to compromise. But Mandela refused to abandon the core principles of the movement. He believed freedom must be genuine, not symbolic. The government kept trying to divide the resistance by offering Mandela his freedom if he gave up the struggle. He refused every offer. He said that freedom was meaningless if his people remained oppressed. He would not walk out of prison unless all South Africans walked with him. Mandela understood something essential. True leadership was not about personal freedom, it was about collective liberation. As the 1980s progressed, change moved closer. Protests intensified. The world condemned apartheid more loudly. South Africa faced isolation. The system began to crack under global pressure and internal resistance. Mandela's name grew larger than any wall that tried to contain it. Then came the moment that would change history. On a warm day in February 1990, after 27 years of imprisonment, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison.
He stepped into the light with a steady stride, hand raised, Winnie beside him. Millions watched around the world. Some cried, some cheered, some held their breath. Mandela walked not as a broken man, but as a symbol of hope and endurance. His hair was gray now. His face carried lines of struggle, but his spirit was unshaken. He had entered prison as a young man. He emerged as an elder, wise and calm, carrying the weight of a nation's dreams. And he knew his work was only beginning.
When Nelson Mandela stepped into freedom in 1990, the world saw a moment that felt almost impossible. A man imprisoned for 27 years had emerged not with bitterness, but with grace. Not with anger, but with clarity. He carried himself calmly, standing tall, his fist raised not in fury, but in promise. The journey ahead would test him once again, but Mandela was ready. The world wanted to hear his voice. Crowds gathered wherever he went. Journalists followed his every step. Leaders across the globe invited him into their offices. He was no longer just a South African figure. He had become a global symbol of courage and justice. But Mandela did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man returning to unfinished work. For him, freedom was not a celebration. It was a responsibility to rebuild a nation broken by apartheid, a responsibility to guide people who were hurting, angry, divided, and uncertain of the future. South Africa, after Mandela's release, was a land at a crossroads. Tensions were high. Violence erupted in many communities. Political groups clashed. The old government still held power. The new future was not yet clear. It was a fragile moment, a moment that could lead to peace or disaster. Mandela understood this danger more than anyone. Instead of fueling anger, he spoke continually of reconciliation. He reminded his people that freedom meant building, not destroying. He said that the future of South Africa depended on forgiveness, understanding, and unity. He met with leaders of the apartheid government, including F.W. de Klerk. These meetings were not easy. They were filled with tension and mistrust. But Mandela approached each conversation with patience. He believed real change required sitting with one's enemies, not avoiding them. He believed peace was created through dialogue, not silence. Mandela also traveled across the country, visiting communities torn apart by violence. He spoke at funerals, comforted grieving families, and appealed for calm. People listened to him because he had earned their respect through sacrifice. He spoke with the weight of his suffering, the wisdom of his years, and the softness of a man who understood human pain deeply. One of Mandela's greatest strengths was his ability to see humanity in everyone, even those who had once oppressed him. When he visited the widow of Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid, the world was stunned. But Mandela believed healing required acts of courage. He refused to let hatred guide the future. He wanted a nation where past enemies could sit at the same table. Meanwhile, negotiations continued. Years of discussions, agreements, disagreements, and political battles shaped the path toward democracy. Mandela worked tirelessly, balancing the demands of his movement with the need for national stability. He spoke often with Oliver Tambo, his lifelong friend who had led the ANC in exile. Tambo, weakened by illness, returned to South Africa, and Mandela greeted him with deep emotion. Their reunion symbolized the unity required for the days ahead.
By 1993, progress had been made.
talks had created a framework for a new South Africa, one where all citizens would vote equally. But the struggle took a painful turn when Chris Hani, a beloved leader, was assassinated. His death threatened to ignite widespread violence. Mandela stepped forward with the calm authority the nation desperately needed. He addressed the country on television, urging people not to respond with rage. His words restored control in a moment when chaos seemed inevitable. Then came the day that changed everything. In April 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election. For the first time in the nation's long history, Black, white, Indian, and colored South Africans all stood in the same lines, under the same sun, holding the same ballot. The lines stretched for miles. Elders who had waited a lifetime for this moment stood with tears in their eyes. Young people walked with pride. Families brought their children, wanting them to witness history. Mandela stood in line like any other citizen, quietly, humbly, casting his vote for a future he had fought for all his life. When the results came, Mandela became the first Black president of South Africa. The world watched as he stood before a cheering crowd at the Union Buildings in Pretoria. His inauguration was not just a political ceremony, it was a moment of rebirth. Mandela spoke of forgiveness, unity, and rebuilding. He said he intended to lead a government that served all people equally. The shift in the nation was profound. Symbols of division began to fall. New symbols of unity rose. Mandela created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Instead of revenge, South Africa chose truth. Instead of punishment, it chose healing. Victims and perpetrators sat in the same rooms, telling stories, facing pain, seeking closure. It was not perfect, it was not easy, but it allowed a wounded nation to breathe. Mandela also knew the importance of everyday unity. One of his most memorable acts was with the national rugby team. Rugby had long been seen as a white symbol, but Mandela saw an opportunity. During the 1995 Rugby World Cup, he wore the green and gold jersey, stunning the world and inspiring the nation. When the Springboks won the championship, it felt as though the entire country won. Black and white South Africans celebrated together, something once unimaginable. Mandela's presidency was not about power, it was about service. He pushed for housing, education, healthcare, and reconciliation. He traveled to communities, shook hands with minors, danced with children, and visited hospitals. His leadership style was simple. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions. He treated everyone with the same respect, whether they were presidents or cleaners. After one term, Mandela stepped down from the presidency. He believed in passing the torch, in allowing new voices to shape the future. He retired not as a man seeking rest, but as an elder statesman devoted to peace. He continued his work through the Nelson Mandela Foundation, focusing on education, HIV awareness, and conflict resolution. He became a global ambassador of kindness, meeting leaders, inspiring youth, and reminding the world that change was possible. As Mandela aged, he spoke frequently about the importance of love over hatred, hope over fear, and unity over division. His health began to decline slowly. He became quieter, more reflective, but his presence remained powerful. Even in old age, he was a symbol of humanity's greatest potential. When Nelson Mandela passed away in 2013 at the age of 95, the world mourned like it had lost a father. Millions gathered in cities and villages across continents. Flags were lowered, songs were sung, people prayed, cried, and celebrated his life.
Leaders from nearly every nation traveled to South Africa to honor him. His legacy was not the absence of struggle, but the triumph of the human spirit. Mandela had shown that forgiveness could conquer hatred, that courage could defeat oppression, and that dignity could survive even the harshest prison. He left behind a simple message, a message he lived, not just spoke, a message that continues to echo in classrooms, homes, parliaments, and hearts around the world. The message that one person, armed with compassion and determination, can help heal a nation, and that every ordinary life contains the possibility of extraordinary change.